Okay, so next up we'll be having Fiona Topesh, who is a PhD research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods.
Yeah, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me fine. Thanks for sticking around. It's been a long day, but I was really delighted to see so many friendly faces, and I really enjoyed the in-person format again, and all the breaks and like the chit-chat between. So I'm a PhD student from Germany, and the work I want to present to you today is joint work with Antonia Langenhoff, who's in the back, and Mahesh Srinivasan, who's sitting here. So broadly speaking, what we do is less of like applied field work and more fundamental basic research on cognitive downstream consequences of the experience of scarcity. And so what I mean when I say scarcity is basically the condition of having insufficient resources to cope with demands. Something we've been talking about a lot today is money scarcity, but there are also different domains of scarcity, like time scarcity, what probably all of us experience regularly, but also things like food scarcity, friends, water, more mundane things like milk, phone battery, or toilet paper. And the idea of all of this is that all these different domains of scarcity have similar downstream consequences on cognition and decision making. And so basically there's this theory of a scarcity, that scarcity creates its own mindset. And one of these effects is the tunneling effect. And the tunneling effect has basically two broad categories that you can look at. So first, the idea is that people who experience scarcity elicit greater focus on the scarce resource itself. So they're very focused to make ends meet with the limited budget they have. But this kind of comes at a cost, namely attention and neglect of everything that falls outside of this tunnel. So greater focus, better performance, but also at the same time, worse performance on everything that falls outside. And so we can see this in like the wild or everyday life in things like payday loans, where people experiencing poverty are often willing to take interest rates of up to like 800% or something like that in order to receive money the same day. And then also when we look at insurances, we can see that poor people often fail to enroll in insurance programs, even if they are highly subsidized. So these are kind of like examples in our everyday life, and in order to experimentally test this idea of tunneling with its negative and positive effects, the authors Shah, Mullainathan, and Shafir in 2012 came up with different game settings in which they experimentally induced scarcity. And so what I want to do in my talk today is basically challenge the interpretation of their data and provide you with an alternative interpretation. And I hope that I can convince you by this kind of like new account of looking at their results at the end of the talk. So just to give you an idea of how influential this paper is, it has been cited multiple times today already. I obviously have a good eye for the citation. It was cited over 1,300 times in the last 10 years. It's published in Science, which is a very famous news journal. It was also covered broadly in like mainstream media. I just looked at the English-speaking media, but like basically everyone was talking about it at some point. And so I would think that it's a very influential study that still has a huge influence also on policy making and the way we kind of design our studies today. And in this paper, they report 5 different experiments, and we will zoom in on one of these experiments, namely the Angry Blueberries experiment. And so now I will present to you the setup of this experiment in a lot of detail, because it's really the details that I want to zoom in on. So the Angry Blueberries experiment is basically like Angry Birds, which probably most of us are familiar with. So it's a slingshot game where you kind of like aim at targets. They have always 7 targets on each level. And then you try to clear the targets. By clearing the targets, you earn points, and then you're incentivized by how many points you earned by the end of the experiment. And the manipulation here was that some participants were rich, with 15 points per level, or and 150 points throughout the whole game, and others were poor with only 3 shots per level and 30 throughout the whole game. And so because participants could always move to the next level whenever they wanted to, this means that in theory, rich participants should have been 5 times as successful in this game as poor participants because they had 5 times as many shots. So it was a 2x2 design. The second manipulation is borrowing versus no borrowing. In the no borrowing condition, if, for example, a poor participant exceeded their 3 shots, they fired their 3 shots, they would automatically move to the next level. So they can't borrow from future rounds. In the borrow condition, you could, after your 3 shots, you could decide to fire a 4th shot, and then that would mean that not only 1 shot would be subtracted from your overall budget, but 2 shots, because there was an interest rate of 100%. And so with this game, the authors tried to make an argument for the tunneling effect, which means greater focus and attentional neglect. And so now I will first present to you the kind of stream of argument of the authors from the original paper. So the greater focus bit there, they zoomed in on the no borrow condition, and they reported that when you look at the time people spent aiming with the first shot of each level, which is kind of like a proxy for how engaged people are or how focused people are, you can see that poor participants spend more time aiming. This effect is really robust and replicates very well. When you then look at performance, here you see points per shot throughout the game. Points per shot is basically a measure for how efficient you were with each single shot. And there you see a huge difference. So poor participants are much more efficient with each single shot throughout the whole game. So they kind of like this greater focus, that's the idea, leads to better performance throughout the game. The attentional neglect bit, there they only looked at the borrow condition, because borrowing is the DV they're interested in. And so when you look at how much people borrow, you can see that poor participants are much more likely to borrow, and they borrow much more as a fraction of their budget. And that also has downstream consequences for their performance in terms of points per shot. Here you can see an interaction effect. So for the no borrow condition is the one that I talked about earlier. There, poor participants are much better than rich participants, but the performance of poor participants drops when you allow them to borrow. So this kind of like can be interpreted as over borrowing, because they would be better off if they wouldn't borrow. And so the author's conclusion from this is, taken together, these studies provide compelling support for the notion that scarcity elicits greater engagement, and that a focus on some problems lead to a neglect of others, which manifests in behaviors such as overborrowing. And so now we want to challenge this interpretation of the data and want to provide an alternative explanation, both regarding greater focus and attentional neglect. And we do so by reanalyzing the data. So the original authors replicated themselves with a much larger sample in 2019, or it was published in 2019. And the data is publicly available on OSF. So we downloaded the data and we looked at it more like in detail. So I will talk you through the different kind of pieces of argument and kind of give you a counter argument from our side in a way. So the first one is that poor participants spend more time aiming on their first shot, which is also what we find when we reanalyze their data, obviously. But poor participants do not earn more points on this first shot. So when you look at points earned per shot only on the first shot of each level, you see that poor participants perform just as well as rich participants. There's no significant difference. Now, when you do this also for shot 2 and 3, because poor participants only had 3 shots, you can't compare more than that, you see the same pattern. There's no significant difference. So this seems puzzling at first, because again, we also replicated their analysis that poor participants do earn more points throughout the whole, per shot throughout the whole game. But this is actually obviously not due to better performance on each shot individually, but it's due to the fact that later shots are less profitable on each level for everyone, and poor participants are, by the structure of the game, forced to only use the first 3. and they can't use shot 4 to 15. So let me visualize this for you. Here you have points per shot, and then on the x-axis you have the shots individually and how many points participants earned on these shots. And you can see that you have a decreasing efficiency with the time over each level. So because poor participants can only use the rather efficient shots in the beginning, they are more efficient throughout the whole game. Here's the number of shots used per level. And so, they obviously use less shots. So the better performance is not due to greater focus, but due to the game structure. So let me get to attentional neglect. Again, only the borrow condition. Here, poor participants borrow more often in absolute terms, so we replicated the initial analyses. But we see that this is not true when you look at it in kind of like relative terms. What do I mean by this? So I kind of defined tempting levels, which are levels in which I face the decision of whether I want to borrow or not. So this means for poor participants, having exhausted your budget of 3 shots and still having targets to clear on a level. For rich participants, it means exhausting your budget of 15 shots. And so for the poor, they face this decision of whether they want to borrow from the future in 48% of the cases. And this is only true in 2% of the cases for the rich. So the rich virtually are never in a situation where they could borrow from the future. Like, it's just not possible, right? And so when you take this into account and like only zoom in on the cases where people could potentially borrow, we see a very different picture. So when poor participants face this decision, they borrow in about 61% of the cases. When rich face this decision, they borrow in 49% of the cases. So much more frequently when you kind of take this into account. So here I also would conclude that overborrowing is actually not due to an attentional neglect, but again to the game structure, because we do see that poor people borrow more often, but that's just because they are more often in the situation where they could borrow. It doesn't have anything to do with like cognitive mechanisms behind it. And so here you could argue that the rich participants, because there's only like very little data on them, because it's only in 2% of the cases, we probably see some sort of like selection effects, because it's probably not every rich participant faced this decision because of these different base rates. So we came up with a new experiment that was funded by SIGA, thanks for the money. And so we substituted the borrowing option with buying insurances against a drought. It was kind of like a different story behind the game that we came up with. But basically what we did is that on the first 10 levels of each, on the first 10 levels, the participants had the option to buy insurances. And so we kept this intertemporal component that's kind of like similar to the borrowing from the future. But we have the same base rate for everyone. So everyone made this decision 10 times. Insurances, we designed them in a way that they varied on the expected value. So insurances with positive expected value means that a rational agent would buy them because the costs are lower than the expected returns of this insurance. Negative expected value means that a rational agent should not buy them because they're kind of like too costly for what they get you. And so just shortly showing you the results of this, the main result on attentional neglect. When looking at the main effect of our manipulation of poor and rich on the likelihood of buying insurances, we don't see a significant effect. So again, to remind you, if there would be attentional neglect going on, we would expect poor participants to be less likely to buy insurances. But we don't observe this. And then when you look at the interaction effect of expected value in our manipulation on the likelihood of buying an insurance, we see that in the positive domain, there's no significant difference between rich and poor. But in the negative domain, poor participants are less likely to kind of like fall prey for the scam insurances that we came up with, or for the insurances that are kind of too costly. So if anything, we again see some support for greater focus rather than attentional neglect. And so what does this mean for the interpretation of the data? So we do not find evidence for the cognitive mechanism of tunneling. It is not really greater focus that leads to the better performance, and it's not attentional neglect that leads to overborrowing. But in both of these behavioral results, better performance and overborrowing, it seems to be mainly driven by the game structure. If we dig even deeper into the data, we can find support for like a very limited greater focus, but really literally nothing for attentional neglect. The time today is too short to get into these analyses, but please ask me about them if you're interested. And so something I want to stress now that I'm running out of time is that this game structure might still very well unfortunately mimic the structure of the real world. So when we think about these payday loans, I guess very few of us have been in a situation where we even thought about taking out a payday loan. So poor participants might just face this decision much more often, and that's then resulting in overborrowing to very bad conditions. Yeah, that's it, and this is kind of like a summary. Thank you.
Thanks, that was great. On the one hand, I'm tempted to say, would you like to tell us about more of the results to help you out? But I also had one question, which is, while you were presenting, I was struck by it seemed odd for points per shot to be the right thing to look at for the borrowing result. And I didn't remember what the original paper looked at, but I thought the result was maybe that your overall score, like the overall amount you earn, is lower if you're allowed to borrow versus not. So not per shot, but rather overall in the poor condition and not the rich condition. Is that right?
That is correct, but it's the same basically, right? Like you just have to multiply it by 30 or 150, and then you get this. So the pattern looks the same, independent of whether you look at the absolute numbers or the relative numbers.
But that comparison of no borrowing versus borrowing for the poor, that's kind of a sensible, clean comparison, and there, in fact, performance goes down. The opportunity to borrow makes you do worse.
Yes.
And because of the game structure, that's true for the poor, but not the rich, because the rich never need to borrow, essentially.
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
That's what I try to, yeah.
So is that just to this game? Like the other games are sort of fine? Or like the other results?
I thought this question would come up, and unfortunately it's still work in progress. I analyzed the data only recently, and I didn't get around to looking at the other data sets. Because we ran this study, I'm very familiar with the data structure in that study and not as familiar in the other studies, but I definitely want to look into this. And I would think that it should replicate. So also something maybe to that point, we replicated all these kind of like new analyses also in our data and our replication of the original study basically, and it all replicates pretty neatly. So it seems to be very robust. At least, yeah.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I think the first sort of frame that this is relates to the structure of the game, like I think that made a lot of sense to me. I think I am struggling with the second part because I guess of the selection problem. Like my takeaway also was almost like it is the structural thing that is the thing we want to think about, where if you're poor, it's like Gautam said, borrowing makes you worse off. For the rich, it's just not relevant. So I wouldn't have thought the comparison would be to take the 2% and compare them with, you know, the however many percent of the poor people were in a situation where they needed to borrow. So I guess I just don't remember what the focus was on in the initial paper, but I think I just wanted to probe that a little more. That should we really be doing that comparison, or just thinking about in absolute terms, how do we interpret that a poor person is made worse off when they're able to borrow from the future, that they're not learning or updating from the fact that this is making them worse off?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think the point I try to make here is really about the mechanism and not about the behavioral downstream consequences. So I think that the study really talks to real world behavior and how overborrowing is obviously maladaptive for the poor, same for the rich, but like as you say, they're just not in situations where they would do so. And so I would just challenge that this is not due to attentional neglect. It's not something that scarcity kind of makes poor people neglect, like something that falls outside the tunnel. It's more a normal reaction of everyone to the situation. It doesn't have like this cognitive component to it,
see,
if that
that's
makes
helpful.
sense.
And could I ask, if I could add one other follow-up question? Have you thought about, so one thing that seems difficult to me about this tunneling domain is that it's not very well specified how to think about what's inside the tunnel versus outside the tunnel. So one could take, the insurance experiment and say, oh, but maybe that's inside the tunnel because the consequences are so big. But then, of course, that's problematic because then you can never make any predictions. But I was just wondering if you all had thought about that, like how does one define the tunnel?
That was on one of the slides.
Yeah, I had to cut the presentation a lot, so that kind of like fell out. I think it is something to think about. How I think the argument I try to make is not that tunneling doesn't exist or that scarcity doesn't influence our cognition. It's more that this study that we all cite a lot in our research just doesn't provide evidence for that, for this cognitive mechanism. And so I think there are other studies that look more at fluid intelligence, like we talked about this today even, right, that provide evidence that our cognitions are influenced by scarcity. But and I'm sure that there might be a tunneling effect out there. I just don't think that this is evidence that speaks to a tunneling effect.
Okay, thanks, Fiona.